Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Zamanullah Sand. I facilitate virtual programs at Teacher Development Webinars. I welcome you all at Teacher Development Webinars. Teacher Development Webinars is a social action project to support teachers and educators around the world with professional development opportunities. It is an initiative using the rise in online professional development to connect people from around the world with opportunities which they may not have had due to the old normal of face-to-face conferences. And for this webinar, it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Professor Suresh Canagarajah. Professor Suresh Canagarajah is the Edmund Ellis Park Professor of English, Applied Linguistics, and Asian Studies at Pennsylvania State University. He teaches courses in rhetoric and composition for English department and in the social linguistics for Applied Linguistics department. Suresh comes from the Tamil-speaking northern region of Sri Lanka. He taught earlier in the University of Jaffna, Sri Lanka. His recent book, Transnational Literacy Autobiographies, is a translingual writing published by Routledge in 2020, combines the narrative writing of students in his courses and his own narratives on developing his teaching and writing through these classroom interactions. His edited book, Routledge Handbook on Languages and Migration, published in 2017, won the 2020 Best Book Award from the American Association of Applied Linguistics. Professor Suresh also serves in the Pennsylvania Governor State Law of Enforcement Advisory Commission. He was formerly the editor of the TESOL Quarterly and president of the American Association of Applied Linguistics. What a privilege and pleasure it is to have you, Suresh. Welcome to Teacher Development Webinars.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. Let me see if I can share my screen. Shall I? Okay, yeah, again, now, 1 minute. Yeah. Okay. Okay, yeah, thank you very much for having me. I think one of the reasons I accepted Amanullah's invitation after a very, very long delay because I was very busy is because I like to share the scholarship here with scholars outside United States, outside the West. And Amanullah has teachers working with him there and of course all around Asia who would benefit from some of the research and teaching I'm doing here. So I want to start by saying that my talk goes against the usual assumption that teachers are the authorities in the classroom. We think that as teachers, we have the responsibility to give the knowledge, language norms, communicative practices to our students as we understand them. But there are good reasons why we have to learn a lot and learn a lot from our students. So I'll give a couple of examples why as teachers, it's good for us to listen to our students and observe how they are communicating. One reason is that communicative practices are changing because of globalization and technology. We all know there are a lot of new genres of communication, new forms of digital interactions, which are new all the time. Along with that, language is also changing. Add to all the changes in technology, the case of mobility and globalization. As people interact with each other, we are bringing to our conversations different types of English. In my case, Sri Lankan English, Amanullah might have Pakistani English. And when we talk to each other, even newer Englishes might evolve out of it. Because of migration, globalization, there is always language contact and language change. But more importantly, the classroom is a kind of an artificial space. We have a very convenient, easy ways of teaching language when communication outside the classroom is very complex. It's very dynamic, it's changing all the time. So sometimes it's good to see how communication works outside the classroom, And students are sometimes the best informants for how communication works outside the classroom because they are young, they are creative, they are experimental, they are in the forefronts of some of these types of language change. So I find it useful to do research in classrooms to find out how students are communicating. So to let you into a secret, when I teach a class, even before the semester begins, I get permission from the university to gather data. Whether I will, and also, of course, once the university approves it, then I have to get permission from my students. And I have it all ready because who knows? Some classes turn out to be very interesting, and there might be things that I would like to study and talk about. So I assume every class can be researched as a teacher. And in every class, there are things I can learn. So I want to share with you one such example from one of my courses that I taught here. But I want to focus this example about the things I learned in relation to language norms. So there is an assumption in teaching, and I'm going to share an example from teaching of writing, teaching of literacy. And one of the first assumptions is that in writing, there are clear grammatical and rhetorical norms. There are rules about how you should write, and there are rules about how you should use the language. And if you don't use it that way, you won't be understood. So we believe that writing is norm governed, and these rules are important. Secondly, there is a professional assumption. As teachers, we believe if students don't conform to those norms, our teaching is a failure. Our responsibility as teachers is to give the norms to our students and make them proficient in those norms. If we allow them to be experimental, creative, resistant, then our students would fail, and we are straying away from our duty. That's another assumption I hear from teachers all the time. Actually, these assumptions may sound strange to some of you, but even in the United States, or maybe especially in the United States, native speaker teachers usually talk like this. They say, we have a responsibility as native speakers of English to give all these multilingual ESL students the rules. And if you don't give them the rules, they're going to fail. So that's the assumption. But I think of these norms in a slightly different way. There are norms, but first of all, there's the assumption that norms are homogeneous, that there is only norms should be used in one particular way. There is no space for variation, diversity. So I'll give you an example to show why that assumption is wrong. It's a simple example I give in a lot of my classes. This is called the traffic light paradox. It was first used by Ferdinand de Saussure in structural linguistics for a different purpose, but I'll use it here for my argument. If you look at the traffic lights here, the red in each of these three sets of traffic light are different. One red is brighter, the middle one is brighter, the one on the extreme right is a little more luminous. The yellow in the middle one is different from the other yellows. The green in the third one is different from the other greens. But when you drive through a road, an intersection, and when you see one type of red in one light and a different type of red in the previous traffic light, you don't say, I'm not going to obey this traffic light because this red is not sharp red. It's slightly bright, too bright. I'm going to keep on driving. You won't say that. Because what's more important is the pattern. These three lights working in relation to each other. The red says something in relation to the yellow says something in relation to green. That's all that matters. The fact that this red is sharper or brighter or darker is not the issue. So I use this example to show my students that no norm or no actual use of the language, whether when we speak or write, fully resembles the norm. There is always a little bit of variation. So for example, we all, say native speakers, they all speak standard English, but does it mean they all talk like Siri on the iPhone? No, each one of them would use standard English differently. There's space for variation. Observing the norm, following the norm, doesn't mean we all become robots, that we start speaking mechanically. There's still room for diversity in our voice, the way we put together our sentences, our style, our tone. So norm can accommodate diversity. The second point is, when you follow the norm, when you change one small detail in your speech or in your writing, it doesn't destroy the meaning of what you're communicating. So for example, when I'm talking now in English, if I use one Tamil word for a special purpose and use it in the proper context to give you enough clues to understand, that one word of Tamil or maybe one word of Sri Lankan English doesn't destroy communication. We always guess meanings from the whole context. So just like the three lights work as a pattern together, our speech with a lot of diversity and variation works together in the total context. Third point. The third point derives from the first 2 points. It is possible to accommodate diversity while respecting the norms. It's possible to say, yes, I observe that there are certain expectations, certain established conventions when we speak, but I can still be different. It's possible. That's why I call this a paradox. It's possible to observe standard English, but also be different at the same time. A lot of people actually say the idea that there is a standard English is a construct. It's an artificial idea. Nobody speaks standard English. It's in the textbooks, it's in the dictionary. But when people actually speak, all of them have different renditions, variations of the standard English, even native speakers. So nobody speaks complete sentences in their conversations all the time. There are broken sentences, hesitations, pauses, revisions in actual conversation. So the norm doesn't do away with variation, diversity. So that's one analogy I gave for how norms can accommodate diversity. The second argument is that norms are still changing. Norms are not static. They are not universal. If not, English that we speak now would sound like 14th century English that Geoffrey Chaucer spoke and wrote in Canterbury Tales. English has changed. It is very different. We can't even understand how Chaucer would have spoken English. Same language, but radically different. So to explain that, I give this example. This is called the Zero's arrow paradox. And this is the philosopher Zeno in Greece said, is the arrow standing still or is it moving? If it is moving, the fact that the arrow is occupying particular spaces and times is an illusion. But if you think the arrow is actually in different spaces at different points, the fact that it is moving is an illusion. You have to have it one way or the other. Is the arrow at different points as it moves, standing, or is it not standing anywhere, just it keeps on moving? Of course, it's kind of a nuisance question, because what we would say is it's a paradox. It looks like it's situated in particular time and space, but it's moving throughout at the same time. We don't know how long it occupied a particular space. So it's possible to say, and this is my takeaway from this example for my students, that language is changing, but at the same time, it is also communicating. The fact that language is changing doesn't mean it doesn't make meaning while it is changing. It's possible to have it both ways. So that's why I say the first point here, norms are never stable. They are only stabilized for now. That means for now, this is how English is spoken, but these norms are going to change tomorrow, day after tomorrow. We have to be ready for that. So that's the second point I'm making here. When we use language, when we speak, when we write, and use the norm in our own way with all our diversity, the norms are changing in the very act of using it. So using a language involves changing it as well. So the third point is the fact that a language is changing doesn't mean that during the change, the language doesn't make sense, that it's unintelligible. So I'll give you a quick example. About 50 years ago in the United States, a lot of writing teachers said, you shouldn't use words like Xeroxing, Xeroxed, etc., because Xerox is the name of a company. You can't make verbs out of the name of a company. Like you can't say Suresh is my name. You can't say they are Sureshing, they Sureshed the talk. That's a noun. You can't do that. So the teachers would have just marked a red circle around that usage. But language kept on changing. And now what we know is that even academic writers in research articles would say, I Xeroxed the students' essays. What happened? Over time, it became correct. In between, there were so many points where maybe somebody deviated from the norm. Somebody didn't listen to the teacher. It should have happened. If not, language wouldn't have changed. They resisted the norm for a particular reason, for a particular purpose, and it made sense. People knew what the person was saying. If they didn't understand, then it wouldn't have become a norm. It wouldn't, Xeroxed and Xeroxing wouldn't have been accepted. It made sense to people, and then everybody started accepting the new usage. So language is changing, and as it is changing, based again on the context, the whole context where we can infer meanings, it still makes sense to us. The deviant uses still make sense. So I want to show how in a class that I taught, some students were doing something like this. They were using the norm, but also changing it. And I found that they were making radical new changes in the way English is written and used. So this example comes from a course I teach in my university. It's called Teaching Second Language Writing. This is actually a teacher development course. It's for future teachers of writing. Some of them are undergraduate students, advanced undergraduate students. Some of them are master's level students, and we prepare them to become teachers of writing. But one of the exercises I have in this course is called a literacy autobiography. And what that means is a story about your own development as a writer and as a communicator. So, so literacy autobiography is your autobiography about how you became literate. So why I do that is I tell my students, if you can, first, a couple of reasons. First of all, you have to be a writer in order to teach writing. So let's practice writing. And secondly, as you practice writing, you will learn a lot of things about writing that you can teach your students. But the third important reason I do this is a lot of students, if they write this literacy autobiography, bring into their story how they are always caught between different norms, different styles, different cultures, different identities. And as they write it, they develop a kind of an awareness, a reflective awareness about what type of conflicts did they face, how did they resolve them. So that helps with the teacher development. So this is one of the main activities. But then my classrooms are very diverse. There are half the students are Anglo-American, the other half are very international from all over the world. So I call this a context zone. There are a lot of different cultures and languages coming together in this classroom, and they can learn from each other. Students can learn from how other students from a different culture write in English, why they do that, what might be good about that. So, and then I also treat the learning space as ecological, and what I mean by that is all the resources in the classroom, not only the textbook, but the drafts that the students write, the extra readings that they do outside the classroom, the journals that they write. Every week they write a journal about their progression in the writing and what they are learning. So all of those contribute to the learning. So I don't discount anything. I call all of this an ecological form of learning. So this is the background to this class. And I'll just give you, because of the short time, one episode, one lesson I learned. So one of my students in this class, who is Anglo-American, we'll call her Ruth. And she, for her first draft, she wrote a linear essay, just like all of us would do. I was born here. I read these kinds of texts when I was small. Then I went to school and I became proficient in certain other kinds of writing and reading, etc., like everybody does. But on a second draft, she changed the style. And this is how she wrote. This is the first page of a second draft. And what you find here is she broke the linear style, made it very non-linear. In movies, in technical terms, people call it a montage. You have different scenes put together side by side, and you have, the listener or the viewer has to put them together to form the meaning. So that's what she's doing here. And so what she does is she uses one font to give a couple of quotations or a section from a book that was read to her when she was a child. So she has it one font. Then she changes the font, and then she talks about her real life, what she was doing while she was reading this book. Then she has a section divider, and then she changes the font, and then comes to the another episode when she was in school. I sit in my chair, slowly turning red with embarrassment. Then a section divider, changes the font, and another excerpt from another childhood reading material that she had, etc., etc. So you see what she's doing. It's a montage. She is giving different texts in different fonts and section dividers. So it did create a problem for some students. So this is a Taiwanese student, Chang. When they read these essays, everybody in every class respond to these essays also. A lot of time this is online, so students read these drafts online and write responses to the writer to give suggestions and questions. So in this case, Chang says, yes, Ruth, I was confused. I don't know what you're doing. But then he persists. He keeps on reading behind the lines, between the lines, and then based on the context, he says, okay, I think I know what you're doing. You're putting different voices together, the voice of a childhood fiction writer, the voice of your parents, the voice of another author. You're putting all these together, and then he gives his own interpretation of how the fonts relate to what kind of text. You see him referring to different kinds of fonts and text, his own interpretation of what's going on. And then he concludes by saying, yeah, I enjoyed this cross-time space style of narrative of yours. He uses a name for this new style of writing, cross-time, cross-space style of writing. I call it a montage, and I also call it a non-linear text, but this is Chang's own label for this kind of writing. And what I want you to see is, although Ruth broke the norms and conventions to create a new style, Chang still made meaning out of it by reading intuitively, imaginatively, in context. Now, this example helped Mike in his own writing. Mike is another Anglo-American student. He had gone to Korea to teach Korean at one time, and in his literacy autobiography, he was talking about how he had to learn Korean as soon as he landed in the airport as a teacher when he was picked up by a local host. And he said, I want to show different voices. That is how those people talk to me, how I talk to them. So in his journal, he said, I want to show rather than tell. I don't want to just narrate. I want to dramatize everything that happened. So he says, Ruth's example might be useful for me. I can do the same thing. So that's what he did in a later draft. In his sixth draft, he changes the font. He narrates in his own voice in Calibri, but then he changes to Bradley Hand, ITC, like here, and gives a real dramatic situation where somebody, the local teacher, comes and talks to him in Korean. But if you look carefully, Mike gives enough clues in the context to understand the Korean. Although I don't speak Korean, I understand what's going on here because Mike is giving enough clues for me to make sense of Korean. Once again, Mike is deviating from the idea that English writing should be in English only. He's using Korean, but he's not losing me. I can still make sense of what's going on because, first of all, he's using a convention that Ruth has introduced. Change the font, and then I know I have to work hard to interpret it in the whole context. Mike is not going to give the meaning on a platter to me, and that's what Ruth did. That's what Chang did. In order to understand this, I must use the same practice to interpret this. So we did that, and then Mike went on in his 12th draft. He actually introduced this style in his own way. He said, the font I'm using in this analysis is my voice as a graduate student. And he says, my writing in another font and adopting a deliberately novelist voice. By doing this, I'm distancing myself from my experience. I'm doing this because I'm still working on understanding my time in Korea. In sociolinguistics, they will call it a meta-pragmatic comment. That is, it's a talk about talk, or language about your languaging process. You explaining in words how you are communicating in a particular context. So Mike is here giving a rationale, an explanation for his style of writing that he is adopting, and which helps us to figure out why he is writing this way. The example continues. Now, what I'm showing you is right now, not right now what I am learning. I guess you can guess that. But more importantly, students are learning from students. One student is learning what the other student is doing and doing something on their own for their own purpose. So this is a student from Saudi Arabia, let's call her Butaina. And she also in her initial draft had a linear essay. Then looking at Ruth and Mike and others, she also broke the pattern and she started writing a non-linear essay. So what she would do is have a section divider, but like what you find here on the top. Then in this case, she has an epigraph in Arabic. She has some Arabic lines. Nobody knows Arabic in that class. Then she has a new episode that she describes here about an instance in a high school. Now, none of us in the class were from Saudi Arabia. So how did we understand this Arabic? We did the same thing that Chang did, read this in context, looked at the whole context. So we figured out if there is a section divider, that means everything that comes after the section divider is a new episode. It's a new theme. Then the lines in Arabic look so carefully arranged, it looks like it might be poetry. And the fourth line actually may be the name of the poet. So if that's the case, it's an epigraph. It's to suggest what's going to come next. So we interpreted the Arabic in relation to the English because we all understand English. So we thought maybe those lines say something like, you have to work hard in order to succeed. So I had done an interview with Butaina later and asked her, so what did you write? She said, yeah, you guys are quite close to the meaning. Actually, the poem, this is a poem which says, pearl divers, when they dive into the ocean to look for pearls, they work hard all night and come the next morning with the beautiful pearls in their hand. So it's very close to what we said. You have to work hard in order to succeed. And then I also asked, what about that section divider? She said, yeah, I personalized the section divider because this is an Islamic motif. It means a lot to me. So the section dividers I use something that was more relevant for me culturally. So what you can see, Butaina is she's taking this convention that Ruth started a couple of notches further. First of all, she's changing the section divider to something that's culturally appropriate for her. Secondly, she's using Arabic as an authorial language. That's an important difference. Now, Ruth didn't use other languages. She used only English, different registers of English. Mike used Korean that other people spoke, only for dramatic context. So not for his own prose. But Butaina is saying, I'm going to write in English and Arabic as my voice, right? So she's taking it one step further. The story didn't stop there. The person who originally started all these examples, Ruth, she took this one step further. So initially she used only different registers of English. In her final draft, she used French and English because what she wanted to discuss here was she had gone to France as a study abroad student candidate. From United States, they send students out for one semester or a year for an experience of learning language. So she was talking here about how she learned French while she was there, and then she's using both languages. So she's also taking this one step further. So I want to use this example to first of all suggest to you what's happening about norms, our belief that norms are universal, norms are homogeneous. Everybody should follow them the same way if we want to make meaning. So let me give you at least 5 ways in which these students are doing something different. First of all, that norms are primordial, meaning norms have always been there. They are given by somebody. They are unchanging, is a myth. Norms are socially constructed. So what I want to show in this class is creating a new norm, and we're all sharing it. That is using the change of font to give different voices, using section dividers to mark that you are using different episodes in your literacy narrative, and then writing multilingually. not writing in English only. This is becoming a new practice here in this class. It's socially constructed. We all join together in developing this norm. Secondly, norms are unchanging. That's a myth too. Norms are constantly in a state of becoming. So what we find in this room, in this class, is the norm is being, the particular way in which they are writing is being taken to different lengths by each writer. They all keep on developing it in their own way. Norms ensure sharedness and homogeneity. Norms make us, all of us, talk the same way. Myth. Practice is you can keep the norm, you can keep to a particular template when you write, but also it can accommodate diversity. For example, the fact that all of them are using section dividers doesn't mean that all the section dividers are the same. Like Bhutina said, I want to use a different kind of section divider. So the section divider, the fact that it is used is shared, but the type of section divider, how you use it, is different. And same thing with changing fonts for different voices. Ruth started with different registers, but Mike and Bhutina started using different languages in their writing. So the norms accommodate diversity. The norms are instrumental, meaning a lot of people also think norms, the fact that something is grammatical doesn't say anything about values or identities or anything. Grammar is value free. It's just, it's like using a pen. You know, when you use a pen, you don't say, this pen is biased, or this pen is culturally alien to me. That's what we would think. I can actually argue that pens are also cultural, pens are also ideological another day. But it's definitely not true for language. Language and language norms are biased, meaning they favor certain people, they don't favor other people. And that's precisely why the students in this class, including native speaker teachers, are deviating from the norm. Because what they feel is writing in the stereotypical, mechanical, uniform way doesn't suit my voice. You know, that's not me. I need to do something different. I'm a different person with a different background. And think about it, even the Anglo-American students are very multilingual. So they have traveled to other countries, they speak multiple languages. So what they would say is, I want to use English in my writing in a different way that accommodates the other languages. So if you think the norm of English only in writing or standard English in writing is not ideological, it's just a practical thing, it's not true for this class. They feel that allows me to say certain things, but also doesn't allow me to say certain other things. Therefore, we need to write differently. Finally, it's also a myth that all of us must conform to norms to be successful, because you would have actually noticed it. Sometimes we have to break the norm in order to be extra successful. Wouldn't you agree? That is, if all of us speak the same way, you can't stand out. Sometimes we have to deviate from the standard way in which everybody behaves, the stereotypical way in which everybody talks or behaves, in order to say something special. So it's possible to break the norm, but also think about the paradox that I mentioned in the very beginning. It's possible to conform to certain norms, but also deviate from it in other ways, because for adopting the norm is not 100% possible. So, for example, in my case, you might say, I'm using a type of standard English. It's a fairly educated English that follows the grammatical patterns of native speakers, but still my accent is different. My style is different. My gestures are different. So there is norm, but also a certain degree of variation and diversity. Both are possible. So the fact that following the norm means one way of writing or one way of speaking is a myth. So having looked at that, now let's come to the lesson I learned. When I thought about diversity in writing, I have traveled a lot in the extent that I thought was possible. Long time ago, I thought, when I was really a beginner in teaching, that all of us have to conform to British English or American English when we write, the diversity can only be in style and tone. That's all I thought was possible. Then I went one step further and I thought, it's possible to use a little bit of Sri Lankan English for an extra special purpose within quotation marks, for example. Say when I'm writing an essay to indicate the voice of some people who are talking to me in Sri Lankan English. You would definitely do it in literature, right? In creative writing to portray different characters. You would use Indian English, Sri Lankan English, Pakistani English. I thought that's possible. But you know what's happening in this class? What they're saying is writing doesn't have to stick to one language at a time. It can be in multiple languages. So this is what I did. This is the book that I published after teaching classes like that. And I showed you this in an earlier slide. This book came last year. This is a compilation. The first part is the pedagogy that I use in these classes, how the classes are organized and what I'm trying to achieve from these teacher development courses for teachers of writing. But in the second part, what I did was I collected essays that the students wrote and included them. So you can see Ruth is in chapter 7, Michael is in chapter 17. These are some of the characters I spoke about in the previous slides, right? Their complete essays are in this book. And what you don't see is that these essays are all multilingual. That is, although they are in English, they're all using other languages also in the course of their writing. Actually, chapter 16 by Natalia, she's from Argentina, she actually talks about being trilingual. She's French, Spanish, and English proficient. So her title uses actually French. But the first part is my literacy autobiography about how I became literate and what I learned about writing, and partly through teaching writing to students like this. And what you see there is I'm using Tamil in part 1, the introduction. I think there are a couple of, I saw some names of Tamil speakers in the audience. So they will tell you that this Tamil means something. And chapter 6 is a proverb in Tamil. Right now as a title, it's there to evoke some curiosity in you. But when you read the book for the readers, the meaning of the word would become evident, although they don't know Tamil, I know that. But if they read in context and they read like Chang did, my student, read in relation to all the clues and read between the lines, then you would figure it out. Then the Tamil would also become evident. So you know what is happening to me? I have progressed one step further in my idea of good writing. I think writing doesn't have to be in one language at a time. Writing can be multilingual. I've grown up in my understanding of the norms of English academic writing. This is an example of what I learned from my students. If they can use multiple languages and still make sense, if they can still communicate themselves creatively, I can also do that. So that's what I learned. And a lot of my teaching now from after experiences like this is to encourage students to bring their own voices into their writing. That, of course, you have to do it with a lot of care. You have to do it creatively, strategically about where to deviate, why, when, etc. It's not a very random, haphazard practice. It's very careful, but you can still deviate. So, and more importantly, the message for my students is like what they say, you can eat the cake and keep it. It's a proverb, right? You can keep the cake and eat it. I'm just deliberately messing it up because I'm a non-native speaker. But it's something like that, a paradox. You can keep the norm and break it. Both are possible. That's a message for you today. And just conclude, I will just leave it on the screen because I've now finished up my time. There are two ways to approach the norms in classroom. I would call it a process-oriented approach to norms and a product-oriented approach to norms. The product-oriented approach to norms is what I started in the first slide as the common assumption. That is, I have to give the norm to the student so that the student will memorize it or practice it and copy it and become successful. The process-oriented approach to norms is to say, I can introduce the norms, respect the norms, but let the students explore it a little further. They can negotiate the norms, work around it, complicate it. Would you agree that sometimes it's only when we break the norm that we learn it better and appreciate it better? So that's also possible in a more process-oriented approach, where by resisting the norm, you understand why a norm is there in the first place, but also understand how you can do something different for your own purposes. So it's a long document. It'll take about 2 hours to go through each point. I'll let you just run your eyes through this document. There are, of course, pros and cons. The product-oriented norms we all adopt because it's easy. It's easy to teach, that I mentioned under the pros and cons. It's easy. We think it's easy for the students to learn. But I would say it's ultimately a waste of time because norms are changing. If you get your students to memorize a particular norm or copy a particular norm, once they go out of your classroom and write in a real-world context or communicate in a real-world context, they have to negotiate multiple norms that are going to meet people, even among native speakers. If they talk to a British person, American person, Canadian person, Australian person, they're going to have different styles, different ways of using English. They have to adopt a process-oriented approach of trying to figure out what these changes are for themselves and how they would adopt it for themselves. So I will stop there. Thank you for listening, and I'll turn it over to Amanullah. Amanullah, do you want me to stop share or leave it for people to look at?
Thank you so very much, Professor Suresh. It was wonderful talk, and we really appreciate that and your all these ideas and scholarship about negotiating new norms, and especially in the new normal. So yes, it's a need of time. Now the floor is open for questions. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat. And Tania Rahman asked, she's from Bangladesh, if a non-native speaker violates a norm, would that be acceptable to the larger audience, native or non-native alike?
Yeah, so, right now, we are asking a lot of critical questions about who is a non-native speaker and who is a native speaker. So, the classic understanding of native speakers by Chomsky is a person who uses English or learns English in a homogeneous context of native speakers. But a lot of people would say there is no community of homogeneous speakers anywhere. There is always diversity. Even in the US, in the UK, there are multiple languages on the media. So nobody comes from a homogeneous community to fit the definition of a native speaker. As far as non-native speakers are concerned, a lot of people also rethink that because we are multilingual speakers. We speak not only English, but 3 or 4 other languages. So what people would say is, should we call ourselves non-native speakers or multilingual speakers? When you say native or non-native, we are comparing multilinguals, all of us, in relation to one standard or one norm, the native speakers. What a lot of people would say is that's an unfair comparison. You can't compare me with a person who speaks only one language, even though it's not possible. Or everybody at least understands multiple languages. But even if you concede that, it's an unfair comparison because I speak 5 languages. Are you going to look at only the fact that my English is different? Is that all that counts? What about all the other languages I speak? So that's one of the problems. Who is a native speaker and who is a non-native speaker? The other problem is this: whether what you write is successful or not depends on the uptake. This is a sociolinguistic term. Probably you would also come across it in conversation analysis. What do listeners do with it? So one of my friends, a couple of scholars here in the United States have said, what is wrong or erroneous or unsuccessful is something that doesn't have social uptake. That is, nobody understands. But if people understand, if there is uptake, even better. If there is appreciation and respect, that's successful, right? So I can give you a lot of examples where people broke the rule and became successful. People broke the norms, wrote something differently, said something differently, and then they became millionaires. I'll give you a quick example. The guys who are making millions of dollars in Apple and Google and all these places are college dropouts. What happened? They think outside the box. They know how to break the norm. And which is another way of saying they're creative, and that's why they are successful. So what I would say is, I don't worry about whether I'm breaking the rules or not, whether I'm using standard English or non-standard English. I worry about uptake. That is, do people understand me? Is this usage or whatever I do in my writing or speaking something that will get respect and recognition? So that's another way to look at success. For some people, success means being correct according to the textbook. For some people, success means a good uptake, respect, making a good impression, and wowing the audience. Okay.
Wonderful. So Shivani from Sri Lanka, she asked, how do you negotiate standards, variation, and errors in a global setting?
Right. In context. Simple explanation, but I know I'm being very mischievous here because it's a big thing about encouraging people to look at things in context. So, but the issue is this: people don't break the norms or rules deliberately just because they want to break it, right? This happens because of diversity. So, for example, in this forum, I know there are a lot of people from other countries, from Spanish-speaking people, Thai people, so many other countries, Pakistanis. And for all of you, my accent is different. But all the questions you are asking suggest you understood me. How did you negotiate? You had a lot of clues for that negotiation. You had my PowerPoint. We all share the same subject matter. You might have recognized some of the citations and or some of the terminology. So all of them help us negotiate the meaning despite the variation. Of course, that involves something new here in terms of linguistics, and that's probably what Shivani had in mind. That is, she probably is under the impression that when you negotiate, you have to base the negotiation only on the language. And what I'm saying is, it doesn't have to be only the language, but the whole context. The visuals, the gestures, the facial expressions. So that's a major shift that's happening in sociolinguistics. Way back, we expected everybody to just look at the words and figure out the meaning through the words. But now a lot of linguists would say that's very artificial. Communication doesn't work like that. Even in writing, right? All the examples I showed you are in writing. And there's a lot of context there, a lot of visual clues, a lot of textual clues. You know, there's a whole context of what somebody is writing. So what I would say is negotiation is easy in context, in the context of all the other, let's say, multimodal resources that are around there. And practically, this is what we do all the time, just like in this forum. In a global context, people from so many different countries are meeting each other and talking in their own accents, own varieties, but we still understand each other. If people are not lazy, that is, if they can look at the context. And in practical terms, in real life, we are not lazy because you guys are here for 1 hour because you want to understand something. So you're working hard to look at the context and make sense of my accent.
That's great. So another question from Gabriele Rombalden from Brazil, and he asked how to deal with errors and how do you provide, feedback?
Right. Good question. Good question. That's a good question because what I want to show is, as a teacher, it doesn't mean that you just accept everything. We are teachers. We have to ask critical questions. So so I'll give you an example, a real example from Butaina. So in her essays, in one place, she wrote versus as versus. And in another place, she was referring to Arabic verses. So she wrote verses. So my problem was, is she breaking the rule here for some reason? So I looked at it in context. Does the versus mean something? So the good thing about writing and the teaching of writing is that we do encourage response, teacher feedback for every draft. I know in a lot of countries, when you have a lot of students, hundreds of students, you can't respond to every draft. But in the United States, there's a rule. Every writing classroom should have only 15 students. That's a rule, official rule. Sometimes we go beyond that. But in a classroom like that, you can do that. So what I did for Butina was I asked her, so this versus, does it mean something different? And then she said, no, that's a mistake. So can you see, not all the choices that people adopt are not, or not all the deviations are meaningful, and they are not deliberate. Sometimes they are there as a mistake. So, and there was another case where Butina she used mostly Arabic and English, but in one or two places, she used some simple words like moi in French. So I asked her to Butina, do you really need that French here? Is it doing something important? And then she said, yeah, no, I was just trying to show off that I knew a little bit of French. It's not rhetorically or, in terms of meaning useful. So the example I'm giving you here is this. As a teacher, I was actually asking questions that made Butina say there were mistakes in her writing. She would do it differently. But there's a small problem. The way I asked those questions was very supportive, but very respectful, still giving her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe there is something here. I could have, or a lot of other teachers would insult the student and say, you don't know English, go and learn something more before you start writing your essay. So that's the bad part. So if you give teacher feedback that is supportive, that is respectful, giving the student the benefit of the doubt, because you want to learn from the student, right? That's the theme for the day. It's not only they who learn from us, we also want to learn from them. So if there is teacher feedback that is respectful, negotiated, interactive, students would also develop a better awareness of their writing, and they would correct themselves. So one quick note, you all would know the distinction between mistake and error, right? Error is systematic. So if Butina used versus for Arabic verses throughout the essay, I would say it's not a mistake. She seems to have internalized the poetic verses, the word for verses, as versus. That's a different problem. But what I found was she was making a mistake because she used verses in one place and versus in another place. Or give another example, if one of your students uses color for color in one place, color for color in another place, as a mistake, something is going on. The student doesn't know what they're doing. So that needs to be corrected. But error, I would be a little more respectful, because I'll say to the student, you have a grammar of your own, which doesn't correspond to the grammar of the native speakers. You can do something about it. If you have a real purpose why you're using this, keep on using it. But here's the third problem. Sometimes a deviation that is consistent might belong to a particular speech community. It might be Indian English. You don't know. So is prepone a word? We know postpone is a word. Prepone, P-R-E-P-O-N-E. American teachers would say that's not grammar, correct it. But a lot of people say it's part of Indian English. And it's a perfectly legitimate word, right? Pre means before. So postpone the meeting is delay the meeting. Prepone is advance the meeting. It's a deviation, but also grammatical. So what I'm saying is, be careful about three things. Mistake is completely wrong. Error is grammatical, but it's appropriated or internalized by the student in an idiosyncratic way. But the third one is a different variety altogether. And well, once again, it's not that I allow everything in the class, but I tell the student, okay, this is correct in Indian English, but in the United States, they would do it differently. You can choose what to do about it. At least be aware. So some people keep on decide to use what they are doing with the awareness that a lot of others may not understand them. Therefore, they have to work hard to give them enough clues, and they have special reasons they want to do that. But in other cases, they change. They say, I don't want to keep on using a expression that others can't understand. They would change. So the task of the teacher through my feedback is to point to those differences, basically making the student more aware of their choices and why they are doing what they are doing is what I try to do. The rest is left to the student. Okay.
Great. And the problem I face also with this word processing softwares like Microsoft Word is that they also indicate this thing that your spelling is not right. COLOUR and COLOR are analyzing ANALY ZINGRLY So this also happens when students make these assignments and all.
Right, and also part of the problem with depending on Microsoft Word, etc., is sometimes they point to an error out of context. In context, that's exactly the word you have to use. But say, for example, you are using a particular word as a noun, but Microsoft thinks you are using it as a verb and would say it's wrong. And it's simply that it's looking at it outside the context. So you have to be careful with situations like that.
Yeah. So there's a question from Yoko Fujas. Question is, it is really inspiring talk. I have a question. In conversation, we can negotiate meaning, but in writing, it is difficult for readers to negotiate meaning with the writer. How can we make a multilingual writing be still intelligible to the readers? Should we make it intelligible?
Okay, it's a great question because I'm partly smiling because a lot of times I also talk about negotiation in speaking in socio-linguistic conferences. And then the people say, okay, in speech, it's easy because you can see the person, the face and their gestures, you can negotiate meaning. In writing, that's different. That's what they say, right? Now, I see what you are saying. In writing, it's difficult, you are saying. But, so what I'm saying is, people look at one form of communication as easy and the other form of communication is difficult. My theory is that every form of communication has different clues, has different resources for negotiating meaning. So in the writing that I showed you, the funny thing, this talk was completely about writing and we were negotiating meaning. So it's possible that you might have come late for the talk, the person who asked the question, but actually this talk is about negotiating meaning in writing. And what I showed in all the slides is that the people in the class, all the students and myself, we are looking at the whole textual context. Even the text has a lot of resources. Okay, in speech, we have the face, we have gestures, we have tone, etc. But in writing, we have other things. We have along a sample of the text. We can read the writing multiple times over and over again. In speech, you hear it only once, right? So in writing, it's easy because you can look at the text, read it more times. We also have to think about things like spacing, font, italics. All those are resources, and students do use them to communicate special meaning. Sentence structure, why you put a particular word in the front of the sentence rather than the end of the sentence. Both are perfectly syntactically correct, but you might choose a different syntactic structure to give clues to the reader. So what I would say is both reading, writing, and speaking, listening have different kinds of clues and resources that we can teach our students. So in writing, that's what we are expecting global readers to do. What we are saying is, don't look at the words alone. By the way, it's not even a new thing to say. In literature, for example, would you say reading Shakespeare without the context is acceptable? Nobody would accept that, right? But in language teaching, we think that we have to let the students only look at the words. They can't look at the context. But what I'm saying is, in any other situation outside language teaching, reading something in context is what we teach our students, right? Or interpret something in context, taking everything into account. So what we would say is, this is actually my argument, both in speech and also in writing. In a context of globalization, There are multiple varieties of English, multiple languages. We all have to go beyond words, beyond norms to understand each other. We have to look at all the clues patiently. The gestures, the tone, the facial expressions, and in writing, look at the whole context, read intuitively, read between the lines, read interpretively, because that's the only way we can make sense of each other, because it's a very diverse world. We all don't talk, nobody talks the same way. Anyway, we are all different.
Wonderful. So there's a quick question from where Kabul, he asked that if you could please suggest any book on rhetoric.
What I would say is that there are a lot of books on rhetoric, but they are very traditional, old-fashioned. Okay, so I'll give you one book that somebody gave a reference to my book. Okay, but I'll give you somebody else. I'll be modest. This is an American scholar, a feminist scholar. Her name is Krista Radcliffe, and the title of her book is Rhetorical Listening. And what she says is, when you listen, not hear, listen. Is there a difference? There is, right? Hear is you just mechanically listen to the word. I'm sorry, hear the word. Listen is patiently, carefully, imaginatively, look at the whole context. It requires work. Listening requires effort. So rhetorical listening is listen in the context of the whole rhetorical context. Who is saying this? Why? When? For what reason? In what context? To whom? Right? So she actually develops this argument in two contexts. One is, she says, in a context of race difference, where there are black and white people in the United States, in order to talk across racial difference, you have to adopt rhetorical listening. That is, be patient and listen to other people. Don't judge them. Don't be quick. Don't be hasty. And then the second context is gender. She says, men and women, when you talk to each other. Have you heard of mansplaining? It's men trying to explain what the women are saying, right? So if you shouldn't do mansplaining. And the way to avoid that is rhetorical listening. Listen to what the other person is saying patiently. So basically, rhetorical listening involves ethical values like patience, humility, collaboration, solidarity, reciprocality. That is, it's not one-way style of reading and or listening, right? It's two-way, meaning I have to also get to your territory to try to figure out why you are saying this, rather than saying, I don't understand it, goodbye. You don't know the language, right? So rhetorical listening is two-way. So that's a great book to show. It captures all the things within speaking, listening, or reading, writing that I'm trying to promote here. That it requires work, it requires patience, it requires humility if you want to really understand it. Okay, Amalullah, I think we've passed beyond time.
Yes,
sorry guys, it's 1 a.m. here, and if I don't sleep, I can't go to classes tomorrow. I'll be sleeping there.
Great. Thanks for your talk. Maybe we should, just one last question from Sujanta from India. She says, in academic setting, is it acceptable to break the norms when the focus is to test the language competency?
Right. Checking the language competency is only for the TOEFL test, not for academic communication. I'm being sarcastic, but what I'm trying to say is it's only in tests that people look at somebody's writing or speech to mark the mistakes. If any of you try to do that for this talk today, you would have marked a lot of mistakes and you wouldn't have understood anything about the talk, right? Thank God this is not a TOEFL test so that I can communicate to you. So what I'm saying is that's an artificial context to look for errors. That's what teachers do. That's what examiners do. But in real life, when people use a language, people are listening in order to understand what they are saying, right? Okay, Amalullah, I think we need to stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor Suresh Canagarajah. It was wonderful to have you at Teacher Development Webinars. I really appreciate that, and very insightful talk you gave, and I was very excited about this talk. So yeah, I know it's too late for you, and you're closed tomorrow. So thanks very much for your presence today at Teacher Development Webinars. So for the audience, this webinar will also, the recording of the webinar will also be available at Teacher Development Webinars YouTube channel. And if you want a certificate on demand, you can email me on info.tdwebinars@gmail.com. For our future webinars, you can always follow us on our social media. We're available on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, a Facebook page, and a Facebook group. So all the links are on the screen, so you can follow our future webinars, our events as well. Thank you so very much.
Amrullah, can you do one thing? You know, I couldn't read all the comments. A lot of people have good questions. So you will get a transcript of the chat questions. You can email it to me later. Okay?
Sure.
Okay.
Thanks,
everybody.
I'll do. Thanks very much, Professor
Good night,
Canagarajah.
everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Appreciate that.
Bye.
Thank you so very much. At last, I would like to remind you that these COVID-19 cases, especially the Delta variant in Pakistan, is at rise. So please be careful about your lives, your loved ones' lives. Be safe, everyone. Bye-bye.